Welcome to Living in the Matrix. I'm Jonathan, and I'm left of center.
And I'm Rich, and I tend to lean a little bit more to the right. But the bottom line is together we try to look for the balance of what it means to be human in today's world.
All right, let's get started. Welcome to Living in the Matrix, everybody. I'm Jonathan. I'm here with Rich. Say hi, Rich.
Hey, everybody. Great to be back.
Awesome. Today we have a fascinating guest. His name is Jason Coker. Do I get that right? Is it Coker?
Yeah, good job.
Cool. Jason is the co-lead minister with his wife at Oceanside Sanctuary, formerly First Christian Church of Oceanside. Jason earned his MA at Fuller and is currently a PhD student conducting research at the intersection of intercultural theology, religious disaffiliation, and moral psychology. I can't wait to unpack that with you. He's building community organizing efforts in San Diego and coaches leadership and other pastors. Welcome, Jason. Glad to have you.
That guy sounds awesome. Who is that guy?
That's why we invited you on.
Is there anything more awkward, like in the world, than being asked to write a bio about yourself? Like
it's from your
there's just I don't know, half a dozen things that have been involved in here or there, and there's always like that dreaded, hey, can you send me a bio? And I'm always like, oh, seriously, do I have to send a bio? Anyway. But
let's start with what really I think is your heart, is you being a pastor. That's kind of where you've centered on. It's your full-time job. Tell me about your church, because we'll start there, because I think you are an affirming church, that's outside the status quo, and I think it's becoming status quo slowly. Tell me about your church first, and then we'll dive a little bit into that.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I do a pastor at church. I'm actually the co-lead ministers, as you mentioned, is my official title. So my wife and I, Janelle and I, co-lead that church together. That's actually a relatively new development. She came on as my co-lead minister almost a year and a half ago. And that was a reflection of the church growing to the point where, it could afford to bring a co-lead minister on staff. And then I was entering into the PhD program at the time. So I needed somebody to help sort of shoulder that bandwidth. But then also the other reality was, and so you guys know this, you've been around churches for a long time. Your history is evangelical like mine. So I'm sure this will sound familiar, but we were just like working 2 full-time jobs and only getting paid for like 1 part-time job for many, many years. And so by the time the church grew enough to sustain both of us, it was sort of a recognition that she'd been an unpaid staff member for years at that point. And so it was sort of partly about making it right. And then also a reflection of our value for more egalitarian staff, which is why instead of her becoming like an associate pastor, we shared the job. So that's relatively new to us. And we've been kind of working out the kinks of like leading together as a married couple. There's some weirdness there. But we're good partners. We've been married a long time. And so we have been figuring that out. The church itself is actually part of a mainline denomination called the Disciples of Christ, which is one of the kind of like 7 main quote unquote liberal mainline denominations. So part of my story is switching teams, so to speak, leaving evangelicalism in 2010. And then after a bit of a journey, getting back into ministry and finding a denomination that I felt like I could fit in, and found the Disciples. And it just so happened that there was a church in my hometown that was part of the denomination, not my hometown, but the town I was living in at the time. That was part of my denomination, or that denomination, and they needed a pastor. So it's kind of a weird confluence of things that all came together. And at that point I was like, well, maybe there is a God. Maybe this is what I'm supposed to do, So I ended up there. That was 8 years ago. And really that project. Sorry?
What were you doing at that time?
Before I became the pastor there? I was teaching at the local university, and also had been a fundraising executive for a sort of semi-large local nonprofit. So when I left ministry and left evangelicalism in 2010, I went to work for the nonprofit world, and we did that for about 5 years before getting back into ministry. So
That's a tough space. I worked in that industry. It is. I worked for a homeless agency that had 5 locations in the United States. We were $10 million. So my nut was 10 million every year. I was the director of development. It's a tough space because it's the hard part about ministry in general is that there needs to be funds, and you've struggled with that entire question the entire time. Sounds like in your journey. What has that been like?
oh, absolutely. Yeah. Just the funding side of it in general.
Yeah, just so part of ministry is this idea, Jesus said, love your neighbor. And so it's doing things out of love, but functionally it's tough to create ministry without money,
Mhm.
And so how have you guys navigated that? Because I think you as part of your bio, your church imploded and then you rebuilt it and then got to the
Mhm.
point where you and your wife could be the pastors. What has that
Yeah.
journey been like?
Yeah, I mean, our church when we first started there was kind of a classic mainline congregational story. It had peaked in the 60s and then went through a period of about 40 years of just very steady decline. By the time when we got there in 2015, it was about 40 members, most of them over the age of 75. They were out of money. The only reason they were still operating is because a member had died and left them, a chunk of money. It wasn't that much, but it was enough to keep the lights on. And so that was kind of the state of things when I got there. How we handled that, honestly, is because I'd spent 5 years working in the nonprofit world, 4 of that as a director of development for an agency with about a $10 million budget. It's very similar to Jonathan. I really, in that 4 or 5 year period of time, really learned a lot about having a different kind of posture towards money in a nonprofit organization. Became a lot less idealistic and a lot more pragmatic. And also just really began to, I think, see, because I worked in a nonprofit as opposed to like a church, I really became aware of just sort of like what best practice in a good nonprofit is, and realized like, well, we didn't do any of this in the churches that I was on staff with. We weren't transparent about our money. We acted like we were entitled to people's money. We weren't asking questions like, what kind of impact are we having with the money that we bring in? And then how are we demonstrating that impact, not just to our members, but like to the surrounding community? How are we showing that the money that you give to this organization produces a good outcome? These are bread and butter questions for a nonprofit, right? If you can't do all that, if you can't demonstrate that the money you're bringing in is making a genuine positive impact on the most critical issues in your community and be transparent about it at the same time, then you're not going to be able to compete in a charitable space. Unless you're like one of those nonprofits that's just fleecing people. And there are lots of those for sure. Right.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately. Exactly. So I think like by the time I got back into ministry, I realized, well, if I'm ever a pastor again, if I'm ever doing that again, I'm going to treat our church like it's a nonprofit. And that's what we've done. So we really emphasize making a material impact on the community around us. We tell people, you don't have to give us money. God doesn't require you to give us money. God certainly doesn't require you to give 10% of your money. And so give us money if you believe in what we do, if you trust us to spend it well, and if we have demonstrated that we are making good decisions with your money. If you don't believe those things, you shouldn't be giving us anything. So we kind of flipped the script on that. The
What
way
was the
that
response?
I mean, our budget has increased by nearly 50 to 80% every year in the past 8 years. So I'd say people have responded really well. When I first got there in 2015, our budget was $89,000. Our budget this year is $434,000. So I think it's worked quite well. Now, it's worked partly because we're also the kind of church that exhibits in very progressive spaces. And so those messages and that those ethics around money appeal to people who are in more sort of liberal or progressive headspaces and in more liberal or progressive community spaces. If my church was full of like very traditional, conventional, right-leaning Christians, it wouldn't work at all. I'd just tell them God wants you to give your 10%, and if you do, then you're going to get lots of money back, and that's what would work, right? Like so, it fit with like that flipping the script fit with the overall posture and tenor of the kind of church that I wanted us to be anyway, if that makes sense. We're reaching people, or we're trying to create a safe space, I should say, for people who no longer trust religion and no longer trust church. So it was important to reverse the way that we were talking about things like money. Money is not the only issue, but money is one of those issues where churches have demonstrated that they can do a lot of harm. And it's the reason why a lot of people have left. So we had to talk about money very differently.
Well, we don't even have to start talking about Adam or the LGBT side of things or creation or like young earth to do that. But speaking of kind of potential reasons people leave the church or kind of have their moment, go back to 2010. I'd love to hear a little bit about your story. If you went through a cathartic moment or you had some kind of deconstruction, tell me about what was going on in your headspace as you left that traditional evangelical community.
Yeah, Janelle and I spent about 15 years in like charismatic evangelicalism. My first ordination is in the Vineyard community of churches, if you're familiar with that.
Oh yeah.
One of the vineyards that we were in for about 12 years leaned really heavily Pentecostal. So we were really steeped in a very Pentecostal environment for a lot of years. And, starting around the early 2000s, I just really began to grow disillusioned with the things I was seeing in those spaces, things that look like abuse of power and manipulation around all kinds of things, including money, but also just the way that people's lives were, I think, really being controlled in ways that were harmful. And so I began to really sort of take those things apart. And honestly, like probably around that time was when it's like late 90s, early 2000s, probably the thing that catalyzed like a long, slow deconstruction process for me, because it started way before 2010, right?
Sure.
I was at a Promise Keepers event in like the late 90s, right? You guys are old enough. You guys have probably been to Promise
I never
Keepers,
went to one.
right?
I couldn't stand it. Even being fully into the church 4 days a week, I just never got involved. That was never my cup of tea. Yeah, sorry.
That's good. That's good. That's just one less wound that you have to bandage. So I went to a Promise Keepers event in Boulder, Colorado, and it was a great venue. This is a catalyzing moment, right? So we show up at the Promise Keepers, and in front of the Promise Keepers is a crowd of men dressed in like camouflage, like in military fatigues, right? And they're walking in a circle and they've got signs, they're protesting the Promise Keepers event. So me being who I am, like I make a beeline for those dudes because I want to talk to them, right? Like I want to find out what they're about. I want to like engage, right? Well, it turns out these guys are hardcore, strict Calvinists, Rich, and they are really like they're livid about Promise Keepers because there are people of different races worshiping inside together. And among a variety of like a litany of other, problems that they had with Promise Keepers, that was one of the big ones, right? Like whites and blacks worshiping together, it's the sign of the apocalypse. And so I just got into like a debate with these guys, and like the head guy, swear, I kid you not, had a Hitler mustache, right? Like you can't make this up. Like he and I were like in this debate and he's quoting scripture to me and I'm like arguing back, and like I can be a really, really annoying like debater. So I was just pushing his buttons, right? And at one point he got so angry with me. This guy's probably in his 40s, right? And I'm in my 20s. He got so angry with me, he looked at me and he said, "I know what you want. What you want is for me to punch you right in the face." I said, I swear, man, I do not want you to hit me in the face. Like, I'm just trying to have a conversation. But he was so angry, like, and to the point of being ready to do violence, right? So anyway, I disengage with him. I go inside. We go into the Promise Keepers event. we sing to Jesus, people come out and they give an altar call to, 15,000 people who are already Christians. I still don't know what that was about. But we went inside and then we had a lunch break. So check this out. On the lunch break, they sent us out to the practice field where they had mountains of pre-boxed lunches, and you grab the lunch, you sit on the grass, you eat your lunch. I'm sitting there eating my lunch with 15,000 other guys, and I look over to the right and there's a chain link fence, and on the other side of the chain link fence is a public park. And there's a wedding going on in the public park. And there's a bunch of people from the Promise Keepers at the fence talking to people on the other side of the chain link fence. So of course I'm like, I got to go find out what's going on over there. So I go over there. Well, it turns out it's a gay wedding happening at the park next door to Promise Keepers, right? And so there's a bunch of guests from the gay wedding arguing with the Christian men on the other side of the fence, right? So I go up and I sort of insert myself into one of these debates. And the guy who was arguing with the wedding guest on the other side of the gate, he gets tired, frustrated, he leaves, right? So I pick up the conversation with this woman named Max. And I wouldn't have had language for this at the time, but I'd say Max was non-binary or perhaps lesbian. And Max was a delightful human being. We had an amazing conversation. Mm-hmm. We talked about philosophy and theology. We talked about sexuality. We talked about all kinds of amazing things, right? And at some point, I said, well, listen, what you really need for your life to be fulfilled is Jesus. And she said, oh, I know Jesus. And I was like, what are you talking about? She said, well, I'm a Christian. I love Jesus. And that, I had no categories for that.
Yeah.
Right.
I was undone. I was blown away. And it occurred to me that the men outside of Promise Keepers who were protesting a Christian event because it was interracial represented a particular kind of Christianity. Mm-hmm. And that this woman, Max, in this event on the other side of this fence represented another kind of Christianity. And it just hit me like a ton of bricks. Incredible. Who would I rather be at a party with, right? Max really represented who I thought Christ really was.
Yeah.
And so I just couldn't argue with that. And I left, and from that point on, my faith just began to sort of unravel. And then, kind of the classic sort of deconstruction event happened for me when a church plant that I was leading here in Oceanside from 2008 to 2010, that was doing pretty well. We had little house church, but it imploded because the Great Recession hit. We lost 60% of our missionary funds, and we couldn't pay our rent. Mm-hmm. And I had, I was at the end of a long period of having leveraged everything in my life to plant a church for an evangelical denomination that had a set of values and doctrinal beliefs, most of which I really didn't agree with anymore, and who were just utilizing me to expand their empire. Mm-hmm. And were giving me no support, no assistance. And when we went bankrupt and lost everything, they just dropped us. They weren't there for us. And so that was sort of the catalyzing moment for me to say, not only should I not be leading a church right now, but I'm not sure that I'm still a Christian. And so we just stepped away from the whole thing. And then stepping away from Christianity and stepping away from pastoral ministry, having a regular job, nonprofit job, all of that just opened up the floodgates and gave us the freedom that I think we needed to be intellectually honest with ourselves, to rethink things. When your livelihood is no longer attached to, the message, then you're free to question it. And so, we went through a fairly long 5-year process of rethinking all of our commitments to faith and to our vocation. And at the end of that, this is not everybody's story, and it shouldn't be everybody's story. But at the end of that, really decided that I was still called to ministry, but I needed to find a different context where I could be authentic and live out my moral convictions. For me, the question was, can I still be Christian and be moral? Mm-hmm. And the answer was yes. I just needed to find a group of people that would allow me to do that in my way.
Jason, let me ask you a question, because you brought up a really interesting point from the perspective of someone who's inside. You called it empire, specifically in context with sort of the Christian organization and almost like that monolith that has this, because I remember that, it's like, it's this idea that your job is to get people into heaven. Like the empire is about transition of people into heaven. And in spirit, it's a great idea, but in practice, it becomes this, you don't really matter if the kingdom isn't using you kind of thing. Did you feel that when you were working through that? Is it like, that must have been pretty rough for them to just say, sorry, good luck, How did that feel at the time?
Oh yeah, no, it was heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking to come to terms with the realization that that people that I thought genuinely cared about me, about my wife and I, about our family, really didn't. That we were only their commitment to us ended with our utility to the organization. And I can understand, like, people leave our church. They decide that we're not their cup of tea, even if they've been there for a few years, or they change their faith or their beliefs or whatever, and they leave. And we're still like connected, we're still friends, but like we don't spend a bunch of time together. So I understand, like, just proximity, sort of ordering our relationships. But like I had a church planting coach, and a church
That
that
was
sent us, a sending church, and a regional overseer, people that I had contact with weekly, like on a weekly basis, that I spent time with. And after we said, hey, we're going to shut this thing down because we're out of money, not because we're out of people, but because we're out of money. And I don't know if we're going to be able to pay rent next month. One person returned my call, and he was like genuinely sympathetic. But like everybody else, like didn't even return my calls or my emails. Like as soon as they were done with us, they were done with us. And that was really hard. Along with like losing my vocation, my sense of calling, something I'd poured myself into for 15 years.
Yeah.
I had just graduated with my seminary degree. Like I was like, why did I do that? Like that was a terrible idea. So yeah, it was tough.
Wow. You use the term overseer. It's like, oh my God, I'm going back to my theology, Episcopos, when we were talking about headship and like church polity and stuff. My God,
Yeah.
You just brought me back about like 15 years. But one of the things I wanted to go back to is, the irony of those guys that were arguing out front of the Promise Keepers about interracial faith is like, my God, if they didn't rely on Augustine of Hippo as one of their bedrocks, who, by all definitions, if he wasn't black, he was pretty dark, from Northern Africa, right? I mean, it's almost, I think I've even seen iconography of him looking pretty dark there. Do you think if they had realized that, or if Augustine had walked up to them, what you saw revelation when you chatted with Max? Your eyes were open. You said, "Oh my gosh, this is a lovely living representation of the body of Christ," and totally blown away. What do you think is the biggest impediment for people reconciling and coming to this idea that we're all in the image of God, that in the end, God wants us to be with the fullness of him, right? He wants us to live in the fullness and richness of his or her blessing, right? Obviously, you talked about the Spirit hovering over a few sermons ago, and of course, the word in Hebrew is a feminine word. I don't know if it's. I know that ruach is the Hebrew word for like spirit, but at least in the term of the hovering over the waters, that's a feminine word, and it's amazing, right? So we have to realize that. So what is missing in terms of what people need to bring people together and to understand that we're all.
Yeah, you mean specifically over like bringing people together across differences,
Yeah.
or
Yeah, or like would those people have been so fired up and pissed off that had Augustine showed up in their midst and he's black, they would have fallen down and go, "Oh my gosh, what an idiot I am." Is it ignorance? Is it a spirit of something else? What I mean, we've got a lot of problems right now, right, with the Hamas and Israeli conflict, right? And we brought this up at our last podcast. I mean, what as a
I
pastor,
mean, yeah,
as
I
a
mean,
yeah,
if you believe the social science, then what underlies authoritarianism, which is what we're talking about, right? I think when we're talking about people who read and interpret scripture in a rigid way, and then want to apply different readings of scripture to other people's lives in a rigid way, we're talking about authoritarianism. If you believe the social science that underlies authoritarianism, then what drives that is fear. Authoritarians are deeply fearful. Authoritarian followers are deeply fearful people, and authoritarian leaders are deeply fearful people. And the fears that drive the desire to be in control, to control others, or to be controlled, like to have the sense of security and safety that comes from having really clear boundaries, really rigid concepts that you can live within, and the notion that somebody else is like watching over all of that to keep you safe. That's the desire to be controlled. So what underlies the primary fear that underlies that is fear of people who are different than you. It's xenophobia. Now that gets like fleshed out in a million different ways. It's fear of people who are a different color than you, or a different culture than you, or who have a different sexual orientation than you, or different gender than you, different religion than you. But ultimately, it's just fear of difference. And I like the main researcher that I've read who's done work in this is Robert Altemeyer. He's a Canadian researcher. He's retired now. He sort of literally has written a book on authoritarianism. And his point is that the Venn diagram of authoritarianism and religion, right leaning religion, the Venn diagram of those two things is like practically a circle. So much so that social scientists don't know if xenophobia causes religion or if religion causes xenophobia, right? Like they're too tightly connected to like figure out where the causation lies.
so it's
Now,
not even
that's not to say
overlapping
that,
piercing them. It's like the same.
right,
It's like one circle. They're the
right,
same, right?
yeah. Now, that's not to say that left-leaning expressions of religion don't have fear or xenophobia or racism or homophobia or any of those things. They do. Like, oftentimes I say, now that I've been like in both worlds, what most people don't understand about the liberal mainline is that most liberal mainliners are right of center. The liberal mainline church is largely conservative. So the clergy aren't. Clergy are usually like raging leftists, but the congregants themselves are typically like right of center. They're even if they're Democrats, they're still like relatively conservative Democrats. And so sometimes I tell people, the reason that mainline churches are failing is not because they're liberal. That's the evangelical party line, right? The reason mainline churches are failing is because they're twice as conservative as evangelical churches are. They are theologically and culturally conservative, just like evangelical churches, but they're also like archaic in their style, right? Like their worship style makes no sense to anybody who was born, after 1970. So they're like twice as conservative. You have a double barrier to be engaged in those churches. So those churches also have those problems, and what drives that is fear, right? Religion is an essentially conservative phenomenon in history. People turn to it in order to protect themselves from change, not in order to embrace and stimulate and bring change. Now, there are exceptions to that, of course, like, fantastic exceptions, like the Black civil rights tradition in Black Protestant churches in the United States. But by and large, they're full of people who are fearful of change.
Mm.
Okay, I want to switch gears a little bit because this leads into what we're talking about. You made a conscious choice as part of your church to be both inclusive and affirming. What was the journey to that? Because part of it is you started with being, in the Promise Keepers group, but you've been drawn towards that community to bring them to the larger. It's not like, hey, let's create a gay community. Let's create a all-inclusive community. What has that journey been like?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that journey began with that encounter with Max in the late 90s. I think it was 1999 or something, 1998 or 1999. And then by the time I was leaving evangelicalism and leaving ministry, I had decided that I thought that gay sex is not immoral, right? It's like the starkest way that I can put it. It is not inherently sinful to have gay sex, at least not more inherently sinful than straight sex. You can do it in a way that's harmful, but
Just if you can't say sex.
all other things being equal, it's just sex, right? So I'd come to that conviction before I left ministry, and I decided that maybe my denomination would move in that direction because it had moved in a more liberal direction around women's leadership. But by the time I quit, it was clear to me that they were sort of doubling down on their homophobia. And that was one of the reasons why I walked away, because I thought, oh, well, this isn't going in the direction I hoped it would. And I can't in good conscience be a part of a denomination anymore that is homophobic. That just became a very strong conviction of mine. And so when I went back to ministry and went looking for a new denomination to be a part of, that was one of the criteria. I needed to be a part of a denomination that was gay affirming or queer affirming. And so I found that in the Disciples of Christ. And then what that allowed me to do when I found a church in the Disciples that I was called to be the pastor of, it gave me a context in which I could do that. It just is, the short answer is, it's my very strong moral conviction. And so there's no way that I was ever going to lead a church again that didn't share that conviction. Now, the church that I became the pastor of, as I've already mentioned, was at death's door. And so there was a long process of transformation engaged there. And so we went from being sort of affirming because we're a part of an affirming denomination, but being quiet about it because that's what it was like when I got there. We went from that to being very open and loud and celebratory of the gay community. And that process took about 4 years before we got to the place where the church had changed enough.
Yeah, what was the dialogue internally between not just you and the staff, but with the community? Were they receptive to the idea? And what kind of led that charge?
Yeah, I mean, this is a whole other podcast episode potentially, but that church went through, you guys probably have experienced this in other settings.
You're in now.
Yeah, right. Okay. So that church went through a really significant shift in culture and change, and that was a contentious shift. And so the last thing we were talking about was gay people. They wanted to fight about a bunch of other things. And by the time we got through those contentions that are really it's a cliche that organizations experiencing change go through these seismic, battles. By the time we got to the other side of those battles, the congregation was totally different and the culture was totally different. And so, one day it was just well, we're queer affirming, right? And I was like, yep.
Sure.
And everybody was like, great, let's hang a rainbow flag. We should be doing more. So we really didn't change around that issue. We changed around other issues. And by the time those issues got resolved, we just had a totally different church.
That's awesome. Where was your wife in all of this? Was she on board fully?
She was not excited about me going back into ministry at first. We'd spent a few years carving out a different path. And at some point I went back to her and said, hey, I feel like it's time for me to go back. I miss it. And she was like, I don't know, you know.
You've been
And
down
I
this
said, listen, I understand. Yeah, she's like, yeah, I don't know. So she was much more cautious about it than I was, and she definitely followed me into that space. And then, of course, when we showed up at that church, she could see the dysfunction, like the power dynamics there. I mean, we both could see it, but I had grace for it and felt like I had a sense of like I can see how this could change and I can see what needs to be done. And she was like, I don't want to have anything to do with that mess.
Mm.
So she came and showed up and volunteered and was a part of it for the first 2 years. But it wasn't until after the lion's share of the conflict had been resolved and ironed out, and frankly, a core group of people who were just extraordinarily dysfunctional left. And after they left, she was like, "Okay, I could get involved here." And then she could see that it was going to be okay. And then at that point, she really started to jump in terms of ministry and was neck deep in it. Not long after that. So
That's awesome. Um, I want to go back to something you said earlier of coming from a Pentecostal background. When you kind of stepped out of the vineyard, did you sort of leave the spirit element behind? What happened to that part? Because that's sort of the one of the defining qualities of vineyard is being Pentecostal. Did you leave that behind?
yeah, I did.
Was that tough?
It's yeah, it's still attention.
Do you still
And it's
do you
still
practice
attention.
gifts of the tongues?
I can do that.
No, but you
Sometimes,
that's the
sometimes,
question I'm listening, learning, or asking is, did you sort of leave that spirit-filled part that's actively practiced as part of your own faith? Because I think that's it's one of the more beautiful parts when it's done right in a
yeah,
community.
yeah. I'll be the first to admit that I have not figured out how to do that right. So, um, I think that I two things maybe happened with me. One is I felt, and to a certain extent still do, feel complicit in things that I think were harmful to people, in the ways that we prayed for people, in the ways that we sort of led people along and manipulated them emotionally. Um, and I found that I'm really good at that. Like I'm really, really good at like reading people's mail and intuitively picking up on what's going on in their lives and speaking into that in a way that moves
Yeah.
them in a certain direction. I can still do it. Like it is not a hard thing to do. And that really, I think, scares me because like I said, I feel complicit in what I think were probably harmful practices for a lot of people. Now, for lots of people, it wasn't harmful. Like, and this is what makes it complicated is
Your
looking back
experience.
on those times.
Yeah.
Yeah, in my experience, some of that was very good for people. They experienced good outcomes. But that is one complication is I feel complicit in some practices that I think were not healthy. So I don't pick it back up again, even though I could. Um, there's a whole funny story about that related to being back at Fuller because there are people at Fuller who do that and they want to do it every time we have any kind of a meeting, and it makes me crazy. And part of the reason it makes me crazy is because I can just jump right back in and do it. It's not hard. It's
Is that
called cold reading,
yeah?
right?
Is that I mean, because one of the things about being a Calvinist, of course, is that I looked at this. I mean, I was never a cessationist, and that's probably a good thing. And I certainly believe one of the ways you can get more involved in this stuff is to have that heart centeredness. Is to lead with your heart, right? And we had prayer sessions at my church up in Rockland where we're going for like 24 hours, right? And there's people that needed that, and you get caught up and you're praying and it feels really good, right? And there's kind of like this affirmation and you're going through the motion. But I always looked at the idea of people going la 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 la, right? And I go to Glossea, right? And I go, Pentecost, guess what, boys and girls? They were all understanding each other's languages. They were actually from different countries and they were actually speaking real languages, but they understood it. and it's called Glossaia. And I always that's the hill I would die on, right? And not like this lurching in the church floor and the Bethel kind of movement. But that being said, now that I'm here and I'm open to so much new stuff, I guess I really want to understand is where does it so where is it so unity and real strength and kind and a power moving forward versus where does it so discord and like the haves and the have-nots? Like, and I read this book by Frank Peretti a long time ago, right? This Present Darkness, and the protagonist's wife was always so sad because she couldn't speak in tongues and she was just cast aside. You suck, right? And that's just a terrible thing too, right? So help me understand that kind of dynamic and where it might, you think, have some value still today and in the circles that we interact with. Was that a lot? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so absolutely. In Pentecostal settings, those external phenomena are used to create a class structure and a power structure that is extraordinarily harmful. So for that reason, 100%.
I did not
Like,
know
and this
that.
is a phenomenon. Oh, it's a huge problem. This is a huge problem, especially in the global South, because global Pentecostalism is at this point close to the largest expression of Christianity on the planet. Now, global South Christianity is by far the largest expression of Christianity on the planet, but a healthy dose of that is Catholic. And of course, there are plenty of Catholic or even liturgical, like Anglican churches in the global South that are Pentecostal. But the real phenomenon, like the amazing phenomenon, is independent, Pentecostalism. And in South America and Africa, this is less of an issue in Asia, but in South America and Africa, they just really wrestle with these issues of power, of unequal or asymmetrical power dynamics that are created by these external phenomena, right? So if you can do that, like if you can speak in tongues, or you can give somebody a word of knowledge, or you can demonstrate the accepted physical manifestations of the Holy Spirit, then your status is instantly elevated. You gain real power in the community, and then that power is, in my experience, abused all the time. And so this is known to be an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the complicity I'm referring to. Now, is there space for that in the future? Well, so I'll answer that question by saying this, right? Like, as an analytically oriented, white, straight, cisgendered American man, I will say that, one of the obvious problems with Western civilization in general and Western religion in particular is that it is too dualistic, that it has sacrificed embodiment at the altar of like cognition. And so there's a reason global Pentecostalism is a phenomenon. It's because it satisfies this human need for somatic embodied experience. And so, it's the old joke that, like, this is the other reason liberal mainline churches are failing, is because, they're the frozen chosen, right? Like their intellect on ice rather than, passion on fire. And globally speaking, most people will choose passion on fire any day over intellect on ice. Now, that comes with its major pitfalls, to your point, Rich. But it is also a feature of Western colonialism that we have used dualistic disembodiment as a tool of power and oppression. And so there is a need to re-embrace that. Now, how do I do that in a church like mine that is, white, liberal, mainline, Protestant, and for all those reasons, very disembodied? I don't really know. I think at this point, this exact issue is why Richard Rohr is so incredibly popular among white progressives, because Richard Rohr has opened the door for a lot of post-evangelicals to a somatic, embodied expression of spirituality in the contemplative tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that contemplative tradition scratches that itch for a lot of folks who may not they may not be comfortable for cultural reasons showing up at a Pentecostal service where people are jumping up and down, or they're acting in ways that are not acceptable in white culture, right? And so I think, like, in our case, like, we do practice sort of contemplative exercises, because that's our way of trying to embody a kind of somatic spirituality and affective spirituality without succumbing to the potential power abuses of being more charismatic. That's how we've done it. I have no idea where we're going with that. I think this is just one of the great, like, unresolved issues in my ministry, is dealing with kind of the baggage of that part of my past. So
that's
full disclosure.
Amazing stuff, Jason. I'm glad you brought up contemplative, because Jonathan and I have been exploring quantum entanglement and quantum physics and the unified field now for some time, and in terms of tapping into that. And it's my belief that when you hit that level, that Rohr talks about, that Merton was able to espouse, that Finney, that those contemplative places where you're in pure stillness, that we believe is pure consciousness, right? That's where you get to a place of peace, of relaxation. When I do TM, transcendental meditation, that's where I actually find that place. And of course, Jonathan and I both believe that when you're on psychedelics, you can, through the help of plant medicine, can get there. So, tell me a little bit about that contemplative journey that you're on with your congregants, and what your some of the the findings you've got.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's something that it still represents a real minority of what we do.
Okay.
We're trying to balance, I think, we're trying to spin a lot of plates from the perspective of, like, okay, well, how do we create a context that's meaningful for people who have been away from church for years. They disaffiliated, and they're trying to decide if, like, they should give Christianity, like, one more chance, right? Or they left a church very recently because they've started to, like, deconstruct, for lack of a better word, and they did get, like, somebody loaned them a Richard Rohr book, or they're starting to, or they have a gay cousin or sibling, and they are now wrestling with the implications of that. In those cases, like, we don't try to immerse people, like, in a highly spiritual experience, because they're really just evaluating whether or not Christianity has any legitimacy, whether or not they can be Christian and be moral. And so I think, for us, our space, like the particular niche that we have tapped into for now, not that this is what it will always be, but for now, we are leaning much more heavily into, like, being a space of processing, like, where people's journeys are and where they maybe are hoping to go. And then we do a few other things that reassure them, right? Like, one is, we try to really center and make very visible members of the queer community, both in and outside of our congregation, because that just tells people right away that we're going to be a safe space for them to have a different kind of Christianity. And then I try to exemplify, like, a reading of scripture that is very different than the sort of closed-minded, like, exegetical approach that they are accustomed to. And so those are, like, so in some ways, I think we're more of a palate cleanser for people who have disaffiliated. And so we try not to, like, immerse them in, like, these, contemplative experities. Now,
Well, deep,
having said
right?
that,
Yeah, it's definitely not for the new initiate, right? I mean, it's challenging,
right?
It's
Well,
quite
it's just too soon.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, it's too soon for a lot of them, right? Now, having said that, like, we've been doing this for, I don't know, like, we've sort of turned the corner as a church from the old culture to what, like I said earlier, was kind of a new culture, like right before the pandemic. So now at this point, I would say this is one of the things Janelle and I talk about a lot is it feels like we do now increasingly have a congregation of people who are able to go deeper in terms of spiritual practices. So it's why we've started to experiment with that a little bit more. And, the interesting phenomenon that I've noticed is we still have a healthy dose of people who have a bunch of wounds and baggage from the past, but I'm seeing less of them show up. And I'm seeing more people who have a progressive posture towards their faith and no baggage from their past. And so for them, they're just like looking for a place to immerse themselves. And so that to me feels like a little bit of a shift. Like we went from being a largely Gen X church, like right before the pandemic, to now being a largely young millennial or older Gen Z church. And so I think that generational shift is what we're experiencing. Like, oh, these guys, like, they just don't have the wounds and the baggage that Gen Xers had, right? Like, so it's a very different thing. They're much more open-minded. Even if they came from a conservative church, right? Like, and a lot of them did. They came from a conservative church, but all of that stuff just kind of bounced off of them, and they're just looking for a place to embody their faith. So
it's interesting you
if
mentioned
you ask
that.
me that question again in 2 years, it might be different.
No, but that's interesting that generation you have. It does appear, and Jonathan, we've talked about this, especially when we talked about having some Universalist friends on about the Gen X and all of the parts of, that massive seeker sensitive movement. You think about the Willow Creeks and the Saddlebacks and the structural things of like, hell and all these things that came with it. And the newer folks actually are embracing a more open dynamic, especially with the internet, especially with things on, TikTok and a variety of things. And in fact, our atheist friend, Jonathan, talked about kids going to the cult. They're going to, these movements, or they're going, negative, introspection, or nihilism, right? There's a bunch of different things, right? So, but it's encouraging to hear that you're seeing this younger group who are definitely going to be more affirming. They've seen everything, right? They've born with electronic device in their hands. They know more about technology than we all do, and they don't have the baggage. That's kind of an exciting thing.
Well,
No,
I
it's
want
super
to
exciting.
I want to interject here and ask Jason you a question that dovetails on that. What do you think is, strictly from your perspective, having seen this gamut of Gen X to Gen Z, how has Christianity changed over the last, I want to specifically the pandemic, but even longer before that, because you've seen a lot. How do you think it's changed?
Which Christianity? I mean, I think like
The one in the
this is
media.
one of the issues.
The one
The
in the
one in the
media.
media.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
so
the dominant
popular
narrative.
evangelicalism. Yeah.
You think probably more into the South.
Uh,
That
SBC? Are you talking about the SBC?
yeah.
Are you talking about, mainline denominations or?
I think that's what Gen Z is. Like you said, they don't have the baggage. They don't have
Yeah.
that we all do. I'm 56. How old are you, Jason?
52. Yeah.
Yeah, so we all come from the
Um,
same generation, but it's like we do carry
yeah.
baggage for that whole arc
Yeah.
that happened. The younger
Yeah.
generation, you don't see that.
Well, I mean, I think I can answer this question pretty easily. I think the way that the church, the dominant expression of Christianity in the United States, has changed is that it has tripled down on all of the beliefs and boundaries and harmful language and rhetoric that has driven people away in droves since
Authoritarianism.
the mid
Yeah.
90s.
Okay.
And the evidence of that tripling down is that the vast majority of those folks voted for Donald Trump twice. And so this is a phenomenon that like decolonial thinkers call re-Westernization, where like the West went through a period of post-colonialism, a kind of decolonizing critique after the colonial era, starting in the early 1960s up through 9/11. And that 9/11 triggered a kind of re-Westernization, especially in the United States, in the presidencies of George Bush during his tenure when 9/11 happened, but also during the Obama years. Obama was an unapologetic, like, liberal humanist who believed in the expansion of democracy around the globe. And so there is this reactionary re-Westernizing movement that's emanating largely from the United States. And I think Christianity reflects that same reactionary doubling down on right-wing traditional conservatism. And so
That's its
you
roots.
see this, I think, sorry?
That's its roots.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, yeah, that'd be an interesting conversation too, right? Because in a lot of ways, like, right-wing evangelicalism, it was a relatively young movement in Christianity. But still there is this, like, reactionary movement, right? And this is why most people are leaving Christianity. They're leaving Christianity in the United States and prior to that in Europe because it embodies cultural values and beliefs that just make no sense to them. And I think the church has largely responded by doubling and tripling down on those same things.
Yeah, that's fair.
Sorry, my dog is barking, so I'm on mute. Hold on a second.
No worries.
There he goes.
By the way, I was looking at your website. If somebody needs to borrow Immortal Beloved or The Untethered Soul, or they need to borrow Sex God for the upcoming book clubs, I'm all available. They're almost unopened because I'm an Enneagram 7, so I'm a chain reader. So they're perfect in condition. So let me know. Be happy to drive down a couple hours to Oceanside and drop them off.
That's good to know. I have nothing whatsoever to do with picking books for the book club, but if they decide to read those books, I'll let you know.
Those are good books. Jason, what's your hope for your community? I want to go back to the all-inclusive part, like, to create my impression. So this is just my impression, is that you almost are trying to create a community that would look like heaven. Is that fair? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree. I probably wouldn't, you wouldn't catch me using that language, but I think I agree with what you're saying. I think we are trying to create a community that reflects the
Or even the world.
ethical
Kingdom of
teachings
heaven.
of,
Yeah.
yeah,
Kingdom is really
the
about
ethical
growth.
teachings of Jesus. Yeah.
Yeah.
hmm And I think, like, on top of that, like, my conviction is that the teachings of Jesus find a cultural home in every time and place by being translated or interpreted into the cultural language and values and mores of that time and place, which means that, you know, uh, every prior expression of Christianity won't work for the present moment. And so we're trying to be a faithful interpretation of the teachings of Jesus and the community that should result from that for our current time and place. And so, sometimes I tease my, like, Episcopalian friends that, like, the 16th century is a fun place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live there, right? Like, it's like the perfect embodiment of colonial era American religion, right? But it means nothing whatsoever to somebody who's born in the 21st century, unless, like, they find a particular, like, nerdy pleasure from, like, learning the language and customs and cultural symbols of a prior time. And lots of people do, and that's great. Like, I have no problem with that. Like, if you enjoy that sort of thing, wonderful. As long as you're not hurting people, I'm fine with that. But in our case, I'm not trying to go back to some pristine past that frankly never existed. I'm trying to embody a community in the 21st century that interprets those teachings through symbols and language and cultural practices and cultural morals and ethics that translate in our current time and place. And that means, of course, that we have no choice but to bless and celebrate queer people, because it's abundantly clear from our cultural standpoint in the United States that queer sex is good, or at least it can be just as good as straight sex, right? So we have no like moral choice other than to bless it and affirm it and celebrate it. So that's what I mean by that, right? Like we're trying to be a kind of future oriented community of faith that is contextually relevant and contextually applies the teachings of Jesus. So, we happen to be in a 100-year-old building, which is kind of cool, but in some ways sort of inhibits that, right? So it's an interesting thing to try to do for sure.
Well, I think that the reason why Rob Bell's church is called Mars Hill, and why if you go to the Areopagus, right, and you go to Corinthians and Paul, I mean, I think you can insert that in any century over the last 2,000 years, right? That's the beauty of it, right? He wasn't being synchronistic or syncretistic. He was using relevant, poets and people, and he knew it was on their minds, and it was that idea of trying to find truth, right? Like to an unknown God, and he was speaking to them in their own language. And my God, if Corinth wasn't, it was a verb, right? To Corinthianize, right? So he was in the heart of the kind of stuff that was going on. So that's why I think it's just it's a great expression. And you're going back to, not going back to 16th century, all these structures and buildings and hierarchies, those need to go away. But that spirit of the message is still there. Even the idea of a Peter who puts foot in mouth, right? Because of that passion he has for Jesus, and whether building, tabernacles for, Moses and Elijah and Jesus, or like, what he did. We love to have Peter because we fuck up all the time too. And God knows he was the man who was the rock, and he fucked up. Even seeing after on the Mount of Transfiguration, he had a vision of the living God, and he still does that. It's such a refreshing thing. I mean, this is what's so beautiful about the word, right? So,
yeah, I agree.
Jonathan, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm on mute. I think that's why we come back to Jesus, because Jesus always brings us back to love. Every human being discovers in their entire life that they have suck moments.
Mm.
And that's why grace to me has always been so profound, is it says, okay, you're a human being. Let's deal with it. Let's find a way to deal with it. And that's what I mean by the kingdom, is you're not trying to create an evangelical version of a long, far away heaven. That's probably not good language, but a image and space of love here that's present, because we live in the present. And it includes people who are queer. It includes people who are trans. It includes people who don't look like us. I think that's really what attracted me, Jason, is that from me to you, and why I invited you is because I think your community is trying to create something it's not maybe directive, but it's like this beautiful inclusion that's bigger than, because evangelical Christianity, which is my tribe growing up, we liked to circle the wagons. And that barrier was friendly, it was protective, it was safe. And what we realized is that when we would leave on Sunday and Monday go to work, that's not the world we live in. So how do we prepare to live in that world? You had to cross over the bridge.
I think that's exactly right. And I think your point is well taken, that that's not the world we live in, right? So the reality is that we live in an extraordinarily pluralistic world, right? You guys are a little farther north than I am. Yeah. But, you guys are, Rich is in Los Angeles, Jonathan's in, you said Silicon Valley. I'm in San Diego at the busiest international border crossing in North America, right? So we live in these incredible, contexts of hybridity. And if we can't love and respect and cooperate with people who are different than us, then we're going to tear each other apart, which you could argue that is exactly what's happening. And I think you could argue that the tearing apart that we see happening in American culture is a consequence of how American religion has tended to, colonize as a kind of hegemonic expression of white supremacy, right? And so now we find ourselves in an increasingly like ethnically and culturally diverse country, and we don't know how to feel safe and secure around people who are different than us. And so we are tearing each other apart. So our church, 100%, we want to be the kind of church, and to a small extent, are the kind of congregation that can respect and tolerate across those differences. Here's the problem. The problem is everybody has this impulse, this like tribal impulse to be with people who are the same as them,
Of course.
including like left-wing progressives, right? Like, the very best way to make sure that you are a kind of homogenous community is to define yourself as conservative or progressive or whatever it might be, because eventually you're going to like gather those people. And so one of the problems with being an inclusive church, we talk about that obviously a lot, and it's like plastered all over our communication materials, is that act of being inclusive, that posture of inclusivity, excludes people who can't tolerate very inclusive environments, right? And so there's a real tension there. Like on the one hand, I hate that we don't have very many fairly conservative people in our congregation anymore. On the other hand, I'm not conservative, so it's nice that I don't have to deal with conservative people in my congregation who are upset because of the way that I spoke about God or whatever. And so it's really, that tension is really, it's real, and it's difficult to like break that up. And it's an impossible project, right? I mean, Christianity is an impossible project, but that doesn't mean it's not worth trying.
But what's the good part of it? You've obviously started it and continued it and gotten to a point where you can financially handle it. What's the best part of it?
What's the best part of our congregation?
That inclusive approach.
Yeah, I mean, the best part of it is that for the people who believe in that and have invested in it, it is a genuinely, like, kind of crazily authentic space.
There you go.
And this is not just true for my church. I mean, I have other colleagues who have congregations or other kinds of organizations that are like this, where it's like AA, right? Like anybody can show up at an AA meeting. And you can say whatever you have to say at an AA meeting. And that's always sort of been my ideal for a congregation, is that people would be able to show up and say, man, my life is really fucked up this week. Like, hey, how are you? Not good. I am not good. Like, I'm not sure if I believe in this anymore. I'm not even sure why I'm here. And here's how I know that we're moving in the right direction is every Sunday we take communion. It's one of our core values. We just always practice communion because of just what it means symbolically for us as a place of inclusion at the table. And we practice open communion.
You allow everyone to take communion.
Of course.
That's important for a lot of people.
Yeah, we practice an open communion. And I think, actually, not to get into this, but I think there is a good argument for having a closed communion. It's just not my conviction, right? So anyway, we practice open communion, and that's our traditions, our denomination's practice as well. It's one of the reasons why I felt drawn to the denomination. It's not like this was my idea, but anyway, we do that. And every Sunday, communion, unless somebody calls in sick, communion is led by a congregant, not a minister. And that is a little bit more unusual in my denomination. It's really common for the congregants who lead communion on a Sunday in our Sunday gatherings to say, I'm not even sure what I believe about Jesus right now at this moment in my life, but I'm really grateful for this practice. And that those moments are when I'm like, oh, I think this is working. Like I think this is, maybe something worth being a part of, because the fact that nobody feels like they have to get up there and toe the party doctrinal line is just it's beautiful to me, that our congregation will just love people all the more because they're so like just transparent and authentic up there. So I really love that.
That's a hell of a lot more awesome and open than R.C. Sproul not being able to eat the Lord's Supper at Bethlehem Baptist with John Piper. Infant baptism was his.
Yes.
He was not able to have communion at Bethlehem Baptist. How pathetic is that in contrast, right? And so
I went
it's
to
ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
I went to Richard Rohr's conference. It's probably about 14 years ago. One of the most profound experiences I've ever had was at that conference, where we all went to lunch together. There was about 20 of us and of congregants who were left over. The conference was over and we all ate at the restaurant there. And then at the end, we had a bunch of leftover bread that was almost like naan. And someone said, "Who would like to enjoy communion with me?" And all of a sudden, because the whole point of the conference was to bring the four quadrants of Christianity together. So everybody was there, here's my pocket, don't cross over. And
Yeah.
all of a sudden, it was very silent. We were kind of just making it happen. I'm like, I'm in. And all of a sudden, it got to this one person and she started crying. And I said, and we didn't really call it out until after, but she was basically saying, I've never had this permission before.
Wow.
And we all were weeping because it was the recognition of, God, that's what the kingdom of God really looks like, is it when we are recognizing each other's humanity and frailty, but also dignity. I mean, it was one of the most dignified moments I've ever had in my life, and everybody was like, we feel like we're on solid ground here because this is what we wanted to really ultimately look like.
That was Wild Goose. Was that like the Wild Goose thing and the big tent kind of Christianity?
I was talking about 2 or 3 years later. It was his emerging church conference. It was in 2010, I believe.
Got it.
It was a fabulous conference. It was one
Very
of
cool. Was Phyllis Tickle there? Was it Phyllis?
Yeah, that was Phyllis Tickle's.
Yeah.
He and Phyllis did a conference together.
Yeah, amazing, man. What a great experience that one must have been.
Yeah. So, Jason, this has been absolutely a fantastic interview. Rich, any final questions?
No, I mean, I just thrilled. It's been really eye-opening and encouraging and awesome. And I'm looking forward to maybe heading down there before too long. Just say hi.
You of course would be welcome anytime. We even though you guys are hosts to the Dodgers, we do sometimes allow folks from LA to come to San Diego.
I'm not a Dodgers fan. I'm a Steelers fan. Pittsburgh Steelers is the only team I care about. God knows they're on a little run right now. So yeah, that's it for me, Jonathan.
Awesome. This has been super fun. I appreciate you guys having me.
Jason, thank you. It's been absolutely fantastic having you on. And I think one of the things, just in kind of hindsight, the thing that I've enjoyed about this conversation is, I think your heart, you're really genuine. Like, you are authentic. And I know that your congregation is going to benefit from that, because I think that's what everybody is really looking for, is that sense of authenticity. You don't have it all figured out, but you're willing to look, and
that's very true.
That can be a very safe space for people. So I bless you for doing that, because if you can create that more for people, I think more people are going to benefit immensely from that. So thank you for doing that.
I hope so. I appreciate that.
Any final words from you, Jason, before we head into the weekend?
No. I just appreciate the opportunity to chat about some things that I don't always get to talk about. So thanks for the invitation.
All right, everybody, this has been Living in the Matrix. If you haven't commented before, please do. We'd love to hear from you. If you have a guest you'd like to invite on the show, please introduce them to us. Subscribe and comment. love to get to know our audience. So much love, everyone.